For me, it just quit working, and they just started to go the other way. It wasn't fun anymore. So once I got it out of my life, then things got better.
I mean, you had the most hideous experience. You nearly died, didn't you? You were almost dead for a couple of minutes after a heroin overdose.
Okay, so picture this. It's 2026. Motley Crue is out on the road again, selling out venues, pyro going off, the whole circus, and fans are going absolutely nuts for it. But here's the thing nobody's really talking about. The guy who built those guitar riffs, the guy who quietly stood in the background while the rest of the band lit themselves on fire, metaphorically and literally, he's not there. He just lost a court case against his own band. And apparently, according to him, they weren't even playing their own instruments on tour. So what is actually real about Motley Crue? What's been the truth this whole time? Behind the leather, behind the hairspray, behind the book and the movie and the legend? Stick with me, because what we're about to dig into is way more fascinating and honestly, way more human than anything you saw in the dirt. Intro. Welcome back, everybody. If you're new here, this is Hidden Fame Files, where we go past the headlines and past the PR machine to find out what was really going on behind the scenes with some of the most iconic names in music history. And today, we're cracking open one of the most complicated stories in rock and roll, Motley Crue. Now look, if you were anywhere near a radio in the 1980s or 90s, you know these guys. Girls, 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 Dr. Feelgood, Kickstart My Heart. 4 guys from Los Angeles who looked like they crawled out of a comic book and played like they had nothing to lose. And for a long time, we all just accepted the story. 4 wild rock gods who somehow survived their own chaos to become legends. But here's the thing. The real story? It's messier, it's sadder, it's more complicated, and honestly, in a lot of ways, it's more interesting than anything you saw in The Dirt. Chapter 1. The lineup nobody talks about. All right, so most people picture Motley Crue as this unchanging 4-piece. Nikki Sixx on bass, Tommy Lee on drums, Vince Neil out front, and Mick Mars holding down the guitar. Like they just appeared fully formed and stayed that way forever. But that's not even close to what actually happened. The cracks started showing early, and the biggest one, Vince Neil was out of the band by 1992, gone. The guy whose face was basically the logo of everything Motley Crue stood for in the 80s, fired, or mutually parted ways, depending on who you ask and what mood they're in when you ask them. In his place came John Corabi. Now, if you don't know that name, don't worry, most people don't. And that right there kind of tells you how that chapter went. They made a self-titled album in 1994. It was actually a decent rock record. Critics gave it some respect. But the fans were not having it. They wanted Vince. They wanted the guy who could barely remember the words to Home Sweet Home, but somehow made you feel each and every one of them. The album tanked commercially. And after the dust settled, Vince came back in 1997, just like that, like nothing happened, which, and I love this part, is very on brand for a band that once crashed a car, clinically died, and then just kept going. But here's a detail that often gets buried in the Corabi-era story. While the band was dealing with that transition, they were also losing people who never got the spotlight they deserved. Randy Castillo, who had drummed for Ozzy Osbourne and was brought in to fill some touring commitments, passed away from cancer in 2002. This guy had shown up for Motley Crue when they needed him. No drama, no ego, just showing up to play. And when he died, it was a genuinely devastating moment for people close to the band. But because he didn't have original member status, the story kind of slipped through the cracks of rock history. That happens a lot more than people realize. So, right out of the gate, the idea of Motley Crue as this rock-solid, unbreakable unit, already complicated, already human. Chapter 2. The Man Standing in the Shadows. Okay, I want to spend some real time here because I think this is genuinely one of the most overlooked stories in the entire Motley Crue saga. Mick Mars. While Vince Neil was getting arrested and Tommy Lee was literally designing a roller coaster inside his own tour bus, and Nikki Sixx became the mouthpiece and creative engine of the whole operation, Mick Mars was quietly playing guitar, night after night, show after show, in serious pain. Here's what most people don't know, or maybe don't fully appreciate. Mick Mars has been battling a condition called ankylosing spondylitis since he was 17. 17! That's a chronic inflammatory disease that attacks the spine. Over time, it fuses the vertebrae together. It literally turns your back to bone. And he played like that for decades, standing under the lights, cranking out riffs for stadiums full of people, while his body was essentially working against him every moment. And here's the kicker. He never made it a thing. He never stood up at a press conference and said, "Hey, you want to talk about sacrifice? Let me tell you what it feels like to play Shout at the Devil when your spine is doing this to you." He just played, quietly, reliably, in the background while his bandmates generated enough headlines to fill a tabloid newspaper for 30 years. Think about the personalities on that stage. Tommy Lee is a full-on force of nature. Vince Neil is the frontman, the face, the constant chaos. Nikki Sixx wrote the book, literally and figuratively, and became the philosopher king of glam metal. And then there's Mick. Quiet, a little mysterious, a decade older than the rest of them, standing there playing guitar like he was born to do it and asking for nothing in return. People who knew him described a man who is introspective, sometimes guarded, not always comfortable in the spotlight, which makes complete sense when you're surrounded by three of the loudest personalities in rock music. But it also means his story never really got told the way it deserved. And then, after 40 years, the whole thing came apart in the ugliest way possible. Chapter 3. The Split That Shocked Everyone. In October 2022, Mick Mars announced he was stepping back from touring. His health had gotten to a point where it just wasn't sustainable. And honestly, look, nobody was entirely shocked by that. We all knew he'd been dealing with this condition for his entire adult life. The man is in his 70s. He played through more pain than most of us will ever come close to experiencing. A step back made sense. What happened next is where it gets really ugly. The band replaced him almost immediately with John Five, the guitarist from Rob Zombie's band. And they basically said, well, if you're not touring, you're not in the band. Mars pushed back on that hard. He claimed he'd only stepped away from touring, not resigned from the band entirely. He said he expected to still be a member, still be a stakeholder, still be part of the business he'd helped build for 4 decades. Mötley Crüe said that wasn't how it worked. They said retiring from touring was resigning from the band. And just like that, a founding member was out. Mars sued them, and then things got really interesting. Because in that lawsuit, he dropped a claim that basically set the rock world on fire. He alleged that during the 2022 stadium tour, the massive one with Def Leppard, Nikki Sixx had not played a single note of bass live during the entire U.S. leg of the tour, that they were using backing tracks and essentially performing a simulation of Motley Crüe rather than an actual live performance. Now, whether or not that's true is something a courtroom would have to sort out. But the fact that a founding member made that accusation publicly, that's a level of band drama that goes way beyond the usual creative differences press release. Nikki Sixx called it a crazy betrayal. He went on social media. He gave interviews. He was visibly furious. He said Mars was being misled by bad management. There were even accusations flying around about elder abuse from Mars's side of the band's camp. It got very, very messy. And here's the update that just broke earlier this year. In January 2026, an independent arbitrator ruled in favor of Mötley Crüe. Mars lost. Not only did his claims get rejected, but he was ordered to repay a portion of money he'd already received. The band called it a decisive victory. Mars's attorney fired back, calling the ruling an awful, and Mars himself 74 years old, founding guitar player of one of the biggest rock bands in history, is now on the outside looking in, putting out solo records and rebuilding. So I have to ask you, drop it in the comments, whose side are you on here? Do you think Motley Crue handled the Mick Mars situation the right way? Or does it feel like a founding member got pushed out the door? Because I don't think there's a clean answer to this one, and I genuinely want to know what you think. But here's the part that tends to get overlooked because it doesn't fit the bad boys narrative. Behind the scenes, several members were involved in genuine charitable work, cancer research fundraising, addiction recovery advocacy, which, given their own personal battles, actually made a lot of sense. These weren't just photo opportunities. Some of it was genuine, quiet, unglamorous charity work. The point is, the image and the reality were often two completely different things. And if you only know Motley Crue from the headlines and the screaming guitar solos, you're only getting about half the story. Which actually brings us to the dirt. Okay, so if you haven't read the book or watched the Netflix movie, first of all, welcome to the conversation. Glad you're here. The Dirt is Motley Crue's autobiography, published in 2001, adapted into a film in 2019. And it is wild. I mean, just genuinely jaw-droppingly wild from start to finish. But here's something that doesn't always come up in the breathless retellings of the book's most insane moments. A lot of people close to the band, including some band members themselves at various points, have raised questions about how accurate it actually is. Associates and crew members have disputed specific events. Some things were dramatized. Some timelines don't quite add up. There are moments in that book that read almost like fiction, and that might be because, well, parts of it kind of are. Now, this isn't a knock on the concept of the book. Memoirs are inherently subjective. Memory is unreliable, and 4 different people remembering the same night after 30 years of rock and roll excess are going to give you 4 completely different stories. That's just human nature. But the thing is, The Dirt became the official Motley Crue story, the definitive record. The Netflix movie made it mainstream again and introduced the band to a whole new generation, and so the myth got reinforced, polished, and resold, even though the people who were actually there for some of it will quietly tell you that the reality was more complicated, more painful, and sometimes more mundane than the legend suggests. There's something kind of sad about that, actually. The real story, 4 damaged, talented, complicated people from broken homes who somehow found each other and made something massive, that story is interesting enough on its own. It didn't need the extra theatrical coating. But that coating is what sold records, so here we are. And look, before we get into the final tour saga, which is genuinely one of the most interesting, wait, what moments in modern rock history, if you're finding this fascinating and you want to see more deep dives like this, tap that hype button. Seriously, that little button means the world on here. It tells the algorithm that Hidden Fame Files is putting out content worth spreading around, and it helps us keep doing exactly this, going deep on stories that deserve more than a 30-second clip. Tap hype. It takes literally 2 seconds, and it keeps this channel alive. Thank you, genuinely. Now, the final tour. Let's talk about this. So in 2014, Motley Crue did something that basically no rock band does. They signed a legally binding cessation of touring agreement, a contract saying they would never tour again after 2015. They made a whole thing of it. Big announcement, press conference, lots of talk about going out on their own terms, leaving a legacy, closing the chapter properly. The final show was December 31st, 2015 in Los Angeles, the city where it all started. And it was emotional, genuinely emotional. Vince Neil cried on stage. Fans cried in the crowd. It felt like a real ending. And then, surprise, they came back. Reunion tour announced. Fans lost their minds. Some people were thrilled. Some people were furious. Because, you signed a contract, guys. A contract specifically to prevent exactly this. Here's the thing, though, and this is the nuance that got lost in all the outrage. The agreement wasn't quite what everyone assumed it was. It essentially restricted touring in a specific way, but it didn't necessarily close the door on every kind of performance or creative project forever. The band and their legal team found enough room in the language to work with. Was that a technicality? Was it a loophole? Was it always the plan? Honestly, we may never know the full answer. What we do know is that the rock music industry has a long, proud tradition of final tours that turn out to not be final at all. The Rolling Stones had been retiring since approximately 1972. Kiss had roughly 4 farewell tours. AC/DC has been playing like they're about to stop for about 45 years. So, was anyone really surprised? Be honest with yourself. And here's where it stands right now. Motley Crüe is out on the road in 2026 under the Return of the Carnival of Sins tour, John 5 on guitar instead of Mick Mars, selling tickets, filling venues, playing the hits. The machine keeps running. Whether that's a triumph or a tragedy probably depends on what you wanted them to be. So let's zoom out for a second, because I think there's a bigger idea worth sitting with here. We love the Motley Crüe myth. We love the outrageous stories, the near-death experiences, the debauchery, the excess. It's entertaining. It's cinematic. It gave us some of the greatest rock songs of a generation. And the people in that band, even with all their flaws, all their contradictions, all the messiness, clearly had a genuine gift for making music that meant something to people. But when you dig past the mythology, what you actually find is 4 human beings who were deeply shaped by difficult childhoods, who found in each other and in music something that felt like family, even when that family was completely dysfunctional. You find a man like Mick Mars who played through decades of physical suffering without ever asking for sympathy. You find Nikki Sixx, who literally died from a heroin overdose, came back, wrote a song about it, and turned his recovery into advocacy work. You find Tommy Lee, who, for all his chaos, genuinely loves music and has kept reinventing himself. And you find Vince Neil, imperfect, complicated, beloved, who has carried the weight of tragedy and kept showing up anyway. None of that is simple. None of that fits neatly into a 2-hour movie or a single clean narrative. The truth of Motley Crüe is that they were simultaneously better and worse than the legend, more human, more fallible, more real. And maybe that's actually what makes them worth talking about. Which version of Motley Crüe meant the most to you? Was it the chaotic 80s fire and hairspray version, the comeback era, the raw emotion of the Dr. Feelgood period when they were newly sober and playing like they had something to prove? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely read them all. Some of the best conversations on this channel happen right down there. So where does this leave things? Well, Mick Mars is out. He lost the lawsuit, he's making solo music, and as of early 2026, it's officially over in a legal sense between him and his former band. Whether there's ever a personal reconciliation, who knows? These things take time. Sometimes they never happen. But Mars has said he has more music coming, and honestly, given that he was apparently underutilized on some of the band's later albums anyway, his words, not mine, maybe this is actually the start of a chapter where people finally get to hear what Mick Mars can do when he's in full control. John 5, meanwhile, is a genuinely incredible guitarist. If you haven't heard his solo work or what he did with Rob Zombie, go look it up. The man can play. Fans of pure guitar craft have mostly embraced him. The people who are angrier are the ones who feel like something about the soul of Motley Crüe left with Mick, and that's a fair thing to feel. As for the band itself, they've been releasing new music with John 5, including an EP called Cancelled in 2024, and they don't seem to have any intention of slowing down. Whether another final tour is coming, honestly, at this point, would any of us even blink? We'd probably just nod, buy the tickets, and go sing along to Home Sweet Home anyway, because that's what Motley Crüe fans do. And you know what? If you've made it this far into this video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You didn't just want the highlight reel. You wanted the whole story. The complicated, uncomfortable, genuinely fascinating whole story. And honestly, if that sounds like you, hitting that subscribe button is kind of a no-brainer at this point. We do this every single week. New stories, new deep dives, artists and legends you thought you knew until you really didn't. Subscribe, hit the bell, and you'll never miss one. Oh, and the like button? Yeah, that one too. It's free, and it helps more than you think. Here's the thing I keep coming back to with Motley Crüe. We want our rock legends to be larger than life. And they were. They absolutely were. But they were also people. People who made catastrophic mistakes and somehow survived them. People who hurt each other and loved each other and couldn't always tell the difference between the two. People who built something incredible and then couldn't quite figure out how to let it go, or whether they even should. The story of Motley Crüe isn't the story of 4 invincible rock gods. It's the story of survival. Repeated, messy, improbable survival against addiction, against illness, against tragedy, against each other. And in the middle of all that chaos, they made music that soundtracked a generation. Music that 30 or 40 years later still makes people turn the volume up and feel something real. That's not nothing. That's actually kind of everything. Last question before you go, and this one's genuinely interesting to me. Do you think Motley Crue's legacy is stronger or weaker now that we know more of the truth behind the myth? Has any of this changed how you hear the music? Because I think about that a lot with artists from this era. Sometimes knowing the truth makes the art feel more powerful. Sometimes it complicates it. I'd love to know where you land on that. Drop it in the comments. I'm going to be reading through them this week. That's it for today's Hidden Fame Files. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.